My subject today is how much real permanent, well, first of all, my subject is if the American Monetary Act was passed and we're now going to start operating an honest monetary system, how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? And so that's basically what I'm going to talk about today, how much real permanent money we will need to spend into circulation as we move into what I call a constitutional monetary system, and how will all of us taxpayers and citizens benefit. Stephen, would you put that first slide up on the overhead for me? Thank you very much. And before we look at the great world that will, the really, truly wonderful world that can appear when our government finally issues its own money, let me go over a few facts. Each of these on this slide are issues that have to be addressed one way or another. And in my presentation today, I use this slide, and I have one of a chart and one of a graph, and each of those is available. There's 80 copies of each at the back room, so there's one available for all of you. In case any of you can't really see the figures, I will discuss them, and you can get your own copies back there. There's also another handout back there that I'll speak to later when I get to that point. The first thing on this slide, how are we doing there? Okay, it's probably not readable in the back room, but I'm going to read it anyhow. These are facts. The first thing is the L1 total credit market debt. I think it's been discussed before, and most of you know what it is. This is from the Federal Reserve itself. They have the L1 total credit market debt. It represents the total debt of the United States. Federal debt, state debt, county debt, local debt, corporate debt, business debt, consumer debt, all debt in the country is represented by that amount. And at the end of 2006, it was at that point almost 45 trillion. It's now over 46 trillion at the halfway through this year. And the key thing is the total debt of 46 trillion. That's 25 trillion higher than it was 10 years ago. That's more, 25 trillion increase in 10 years is more than the total debt went up in the previous 50 years. So it's an exponential debt curve, and I forecasted based upon the rate of increase that has been running in the last 6 years, so it's the most current figures, and I used the most conservative figure, which was 8.5% per year, by the way, and that forecast that by the year 2016, at the end of the next decade, if the system lasts that long, we will then owe over $100 trillion. Our total money supply, although the Fed has now, since a year ago, last March, stopped issuing M3, and before that, in 1998, they stopped issuing L, which really was the total money supply. Our total money supply is roughly 12.5 trillion by most estimates. So we have a present system which is truly a mathematical impossibility. We have a total debt of $46 trillion, and we got a money supply of $12.5 trillion. How do you pay it off? Our current national debt is now $9 trillion, and the basic problem is that we do not issue our own money. If we issue our own money, we will have no national debt. We will have the rebuilt infrastructure that Kenny Bonsack talked about earlier. We will be able to have full employment. We can have a secure Social Security system, and we could exempt the first $25,000 of earned income from any tax on the worker at no cost to taxpayers. This is an interesting figure. It's probably very hard to read because it's fairly small, but in the year 2005, the top 13,776 tax returns averaged $27.5 million per person, and the tax rate was 20.5%. In 1955, 50 years ago, the same top 13,000, it was actually 883 then, The average income was not 27.5 million, it was 1.8 million, but the tax rate wasn't 20.5%, it was 47.4%. That show, and these are all adjusted to $2005, and the source is the Internal Revenue Service. So you can see what's been happening to our taxes. That has to also be addressed. And Bob Petit was talking about inflation, and I looked it up on the inflation calculator on the internet. $1 in 1913, what you could buy in 1913 with $1 today would cost you $20.15. That's what a good job the Federal Reserve has done of having a stable currency or a stable money supply, which was one of their goals. By the way, the U.S. securities now held by the Federal Reserve are approaching 800 billion. They're over at 790 billion. That's government securities that the Fed bought in the process of open market operations, and they bought them by using the government's own power to create money, and they basically paid off these securities, but we still owe them, and we pay the interest to the Federal Reserve instead. They spend what they want, and they do because they don't have enough guts to take everything. At the end of the year, they do turn over whatever profit they have on their bottom line to the Treasury. And as we talked about the Fed reporting the money supply, in March of last year, the Fed stopped reporting M3. At the time they stopped it, it had just reached $10 trillion, M3. I don't know whether this is a coincidence or what, but in 1998, when the Fed suddenly stopped reporting L, which was, it used to be M1, M2, M3, and L was the total money supply. At that point, L had just hit $10 trillion. Well, now they're reporting M1 and M2, and M2 is approaching 8 trillion. I suppose when it gets to 10 trillion, if it does, it'll only report M1. I don't know how this works. I should also mention that our population just this past year hit 300 million, and they say by 2040, which is only 33, 34 years from now, it will go up another 100 million to 400 million. And this will require, just on its own, the fact that about 3 million new people will appear in the United States every year. That alone is going to require the infusion of more new money. And if we're spending it into circulation, that becomes a dividend for the people instead of debt for the people. And the last thing, and I think Dave Kelly is going to address this in depth, I'm just mentioning that the maldistribution of wealth must be addressed. We still have to take on one issue at a time, but that's sure going to have to be a quick issue. Now, there's another fact that we must understand, the fact that our present debt-based monetary system is, as Stephen has pointed out, the primary reason for wars. Our monetary system feeds on debt because it needs more debt faster and faster simply to sustain itself. I'll have a graph up that shows basically the same thing that Bob Petit showed. And what better way to put our nation deeper and deeper in debt than to have never-ending war, which is the situation we seem to be in now under the Bush administration. The main point is that our present monetary system breeds war, it needs war, and we will always have war until we change this system. And last year, after the Fed stopped reporting M3, I think, as many others do, that they did it to hide how much new debt money they are creating. I guess it's probably over $1 trillion a year by now. And why isn't this fueling inflation worse than what we're already seeing? Well, partly the inflation doesn't seem to be too bad because by eliminating the volatile food and energy sectors from the consumer price index that they use, they show the inflation rate without the, quote, volatile food and energy sectors. Well, my budget and your budget would be in pretty damn good shape at home if we didn't have to pay our food bills and our energy bills, which, among other things, this reduces the amount of annual increase to Social Security recipients because it underreports inflation. But the biggest reason this huge increase in our money supply is not showing up in inflation is because so much of it is going to those who are already extremely wealthy. The dramatic growth of so-called financial derivatives, hedge funds, has enabled Wall Street to turn millions into billions, and also these derivatives then increased our total debts. And you may already know this, last year the top 25 hedge fund managers earned, I put that in quotation marks, the word earned, an average of $560 million each. That's just for the managers. Nobody knows for sure how many tens of billions the big banks and financial houses made on these. On Wall Street, they call this using leverage. I think Wall Street is now finding out that leverage can and work and does work in two directions. Most of the excessive amounts of debt money now being created by the Fed and the fractional reserve banking system is going into the pockets of those who are so wealthy they can't consume any more goods and services, and thus add to inflation. And inflation has just been defined again, which is an inadequate definition, but it says too many dollars chasing too few goods. There are not too many dollars in the hands of the people, but there are way too many dollars in the hands of those who already have too many dollars. Now, Stephen, would you put up the chart next? This chart, I went back in the archives of the Fed's L1 Total Credit Market Debt Report, and since last year ended in 2006, and the archives go back to 1945, I started with 1946. And then I listed the debt in tenure by decade from 46, 56, 66, and so on up till last year. I've already commented on the fact that it's now $46 trillion. And it's important to note that this $46 trillion represents not real money, it represents debt money or banks' promises to pay money that they do not have. As the late economist John Kenneth Galbraith said in his book Money, quote, "The way banks create money is so simple that the mind is repelled," unquote. How simple is it? The banks simply loan out money they don't have. You really can't get much simpler than that. And when we switch to 100% reserve requirement on demand deposits, banks will no longer be able to create debt money, and every dollar of the $46 trillion that shows up there on that chart will eventually disappear as it is paid off. Now, we'll be spending real money into circulation to replace the needed amount of money. We'll be getting into that. But that's what would happen now. If all of our debts were paid off, we'd run out of money long before we paid off all the debts, because we owe $46 trillion, and all the real debt money there is, according to most estimates, is $12.5 trillion. And I could go into how that happened, but that's a different subject. It would take too long. But the banks just loan these debts back into circulation once they're paid off, and thus they recreate this debt money that was just paid off. But it's a temporary money system, not a permanent one. This does not mean that all of our debts will disappear, because all new loans would be made with real money. It's only the imaginary money that would disappear. And except for currency and coins, all of our real permanent US dollars spent into circulation, this is part of the American Monetary Act, we plan to have them electronically tagged so that we will always know what the total real permanent money supply is, as opposed to the debt money, which is going to gradually be paid off and disappear. And of course, it's possible that electronically tagging the dollars, while it'll provide a lot of information, there may be problems, but it is not critical to monetary reform. What is critical is that banks have to adhere to the 100% reserve requirement on demand deposits or checking accounts, so that they will no longer be able to issue their own debt money. It's my personal opinion that it may be too difficult for government to monitor all the banks to be sure they are adhering to the 100% reserve requirement. I think that ultimately we will have to place all checking accounts under government control, thus not taking away banking, just taking away checking accounts from the banks and making everyone, including banks, keep their real permanent checking account money in a government checking account. After all, checking accounts are and will continue to be part of our money supply, which belongs to the government, or should. This would give the U.S. government almost total control of the money supply. It would also make banks very much like the old savings and loans, except banks would not be limited to just making home loans. Now would you please put up the next chart, or not the chart, the graph. Now this graph shows the same thing that the chart shows, and if you look at the red bars are the total debt by decade. The green bars is how much that debt increased versus the previous decade. If you follow the red bars, you see an exponential curve going now straight up into the sky. And that's where I said I used an 8.5% is the lowest rate of increase in our debt in 1 year in the last 6 years. So I used 8.5%, and I forecast if we're at 46 trillion now, where will we be in 2016? And the answer is 101 trillion and some odd billions. So that's a situation which I think is an impossible situation, and it may put the Federal Reserve into a position that I think it may be in right now, that they are putting what they call, some columnists call cash, some call money, some call liquidity. They're all wrong. What the Federal Reserve is putting into the banks is additional reserves so that the banks can create more debt money and loan it out. But who's going to borrow all that money? I know they're very creative in creating debt, but I think at the point where nobody will borrow the money that they have available, that's when this system collapses. But that's just my own opinion, but that's what it feels like to me. Now would you put up the next, and I think it's the last one, isn't it? Henry Kissinger got this one right. He once said, control food and you control people. Control oil and you control nations. Control money and you control the world. Under the American Monetary Act, we will control our own money, and thereby we will control our part of the world. And I think when other countries see what happens when we get onto a 100% reserve system, they too will move away from the present debt-based system. Now I want to get into the details of how do we get the banks to 100% reserve from the position where they are now. The present reserve requirements are on our banks' checking accounts and individual banks' checking accounts. The first $7.4 million, they don't have to have any reserves. They can loan all of that money out that belongs to you in your checking account. From 7.4 million to 47, I think it's 47.3, but from 7.4 to 47 million dollars, they only have to have a 3% reserve, which means they keep 3 cents of every dollar of your money that you've put in your checking account for your use, and they loan it to somebody else. And when you get above 47 million, on the amount above that, which would apply to most of the really big banks, they have to keep a 10% reserve. So the Federal Reserve would be nationalized by buying back the outstanding stock now held by the member banks. And the government will credit the value of this stock, which we will buy, I think it's $450 or $460 million, to the individual banks' deposits at the Fed to help them meet the 100% reserve requirement. The Fed now holds nearly $800 billion worth of U.S. securities, all bought and paid for using the government's own constitutional power to create money. These securities will be marked paid and canceled, thus immediately reducing our $9 trillion national debt to $8.2 trillion and reducing that total credit market debt from 46 trillion to 45.2 trillion. Step number 2, Under the 100% system, banks will no longer be able to loan out money they do not have. Stated simply, banks must have a real permanent dollar on hand or on deposit at the Fed for each dollar they show in their checking accounts. This means that for the first time in history, when you put your money in your checking account, that money will belong to you, not to the banks. Banks will reach the required 100% reserve by selling their Federal Reserve stock, which was 0.1, and next by the government buying back all their U.S. government securities that they hold at market value and adding that value to their deposits at the Fed. This will likely not get most of the banks all the way to 100% reserve. They will have two choices then. One, immediately sell some of their other assets to acquire the rest they need to get to a 100% reserve against their checking accounts, not savings accounts. Some people get confused and say we're going to have 100% reserve on all deposits. It's only on checking account deposits. CDs and savings account deposits could be loaned out just as they are now. The government, if they don't want to do it that way, the government would loan money to these banks in the amount they need to get to 100% reserve and charge them a reasonable interest rate on it. Then the banks would have more time to sell assets to pay off the loan from the government plus the interest. This might give banks time to get a better price on some of the assets than in a forced sale immediately. This is to help the banks. We're not trying to get rid of banks. We're trying to keep banks in business, but not in the business of creating money, in the business of loaning real money. At this point, all commercial banks would then be at 100% reserve position, but economically nothing would have changed at all, because all the money that we spent into circulation to make these purchases was deposited at the Federal Reserve, or whatever we're going to call it. We'll just stay with the Federal Reserve. So nothing has changed, except the banks have had a problem. They have lost the income that the income stream that they had on the checking account money that they used to lend out, and they had to sell these assets in order to get to the 100% reserve. So they will need to acquire new savings deposits, or they would not be able to make new loans. The only way that they can compensate for that lost income stream is with new savings deposits or with cuts in their operating expenses, or both. So how will we help the banks and the American people at the same time? This is where the projects outlined in the American Monetary Act come into play. First of all, to immediately help the banks, and it sure wouldn't hurt any of us, the government would issue a check for $2,000 to every person on the Social Security rolls, both those working and paying in, and those retired and receiving benefits. This is my theory of how to do this. We haven't made an official decision on this, but this would put about $370 billion in new permanent money spent into circulation. A letter would go with the check suggesting to the people that receive those $2,000 checks, and everybody that's working or on Social Security would, to try to save all or most of it for their retirement. And even though most people will probably spend a lot of it, a substantial portion will soon appear in checking and savings accounts, again putting banks in a position to make loans while we kick in our other programs. It's important to realize that except for coins and currency, we will have to spend every new real permanent dollar into circulation. All of those debt dollars that we now use are going to disappear as those loans are repaid. This is why spending money into circulation by the government will not be inflationary. We will not be spending new dollars into circulation in addition to the present money supply. These new dollars will replace the present debt-based money supply. I covered the following programs at last year's conference, so I'm just going to try and summarize them now. It still takes a little bit of time, but if you have any questions about the details, you can ask them during the Q&A. The first of all is rebuilding the public infrastructure. Since we need to spend money immediately into circulation, Instead of loans, these would be direct grants. This would be money given. We will spend U.S. dollars into circulation to rebuild our badly decayed and deteriorated public infrastructure. As was stated, the American Society of Civil Engineers states that $1.6 trillion is needed. I think that probably about $200 billion a year is all we could realistically do. So I've listed this as over an 8-year period, we would make $200 billion a year available to each to the nation to rebuild its infrastructure. This will also provide millions of jobs and also improve incomes. Some of this will also appear in bank savings accounts, among other places. This $200 billion a year would be shared by each of the 435 congressional districts according to a very fair and very good formula that was developed by my friend Kenny Bonsack, and I'm sure he worked on this a heck of a long time, but he sure got it right. And he mentioned it. I won't get into the formula, but what I am going to tell you, $200 billion divided by 435 congressional districts means $460 million available each year to each congressional district. I can tell you I worked it out what this would mean in Burlington, Iowa, which is in Des Moines County, Iowa. Des Moines County has a population of 40,000 people, and Burlington has 27,000. What that means to a county of 40,000 people is Des Moines County would get $8.5 million a year. This is tax-free. There's no interest charge. It doesn't cost you and I anything. We're just spending this money into circulation. It would mean in Des Moines County $8.5 million a year for 8 years. That would be $60 million to rebuild our schools, our bridges, our water and sewage plants, our airports, our well, you can go on and on. Anything that is a public infrastructure. That could include health care, by the way, and education. The city of Burlington would receive $15.5 million a year, an 8-year total of $124 million. And the Burlington School District would receive $12.2 million a year, an 8-year total of $97.6 million. That's based on enrollment, and I won't get into that. Kenny can tell you about it if you want to know the formula. This will certainly change the quality of our public infrastructure and greatly improve the quality of our lives. And I just want to mention Cook County, where we are now, has over 5 million people. I think it's 5,386,000 or something like that. But let's just use 5 million and divide it by 40,000, which is the county I come from, and now I'm sitting in one with 5 million. So Cook County would get 125 times as much as I just stated we would get in Des Moines County, because you have 8 congressional districts. We only have 5 in the whole state of Iowa, and Burlington is only part of one. But you are part of 8 congressional districts, you that live in Cook County. And the economic, so I'll let you do the math on that one. I didn't multiply 125 times the figures I gave you. But it would be something in the range of $4.5 billion a year coming right into Cook County with no cost. And that should take care of that 17%. Yeah, that you talked about, that they were trying to cut the budget. The economic activity generated by these new jobs will provide new tax revenues. And because an improved infrastructure always results in more private investment, that will create even more jobs and income. This will enable local governments to provide us with the services and protections we expect from government, and without the need to raise taxes. And I want to note that you might say, and some have said at my meetings, well, why doesn't the government just spend the money into circulation now? Well, that sounds good, that if it were allowed and they passed a bill that we could just spend money into circulation, that would let us do that. But the end result is most of this money would appear in checking accounts, and under the fractional reserve system, that $200 billion that we would spend into circulation in 1 year would be multiplied by at least 10 by the banks in loaning out more debt, because they would use that to facilitate more debt. It would provide them more reserves. That's why we have to have monetary reform before we can start spending money directly into circulation. Now, the next thing, all of the Federal Reserve notes in circulation in the United States would be converted over a short period of time to new United States notes, United States dollars, not notes. This is just a simple exchange. It has no economic impact, but it will have a visual impact. The notes, Federal Reserve notes outside of the United States would only be exchanged if they reappeared in the United States. The next step is paying off the national debt. If we issue our own money, we can't have a national debt. The national debt would be paid off as it comes due. We will simply exchange an interest-bearing U.S. security for a non-interest-bearing U.S. security, United States dollars, issued by the government. We could just pay off the entire national debt immediately, but that puts too much money, too much real permanent money too quickly into the hands of basically the wrong people. We want to spend new U.S. dollars into circulation in a manner that puts most of them into the hands of average Americans, not wealthy Americans. So we will only pay the portion of the national debt that is publicly held, which on August 23rd of this year was 5.1 trillion of the 9 trillion was publicly held. The other 3.9 trillion the government owes to itself. When you issue your own money, you can't owe money to yourself. That portion would simply be marked paid. When these funds are needed, that were in these so-called trust funds where the money's already been spent, the Social Security Trust Fund, the pension funds, and all those, when these funds are needed, these are funds that are going into the economy now. They need to be continued to go in. If you took away the money from the Social Security people and said you don't get your Social Security anymore, what would that do to the economy? Not to mention to old people like me. They will be available to be spent into circulation by the government, because under an honest monetary system, the government cannot owe money to itself. If the government spends too much money into circulation, I'll touch on this later, they'll be held responsible for the inflation that results, because we will know who's responsible. Right now, we don't know who's responsible. When there is no national debt, there will be no interest charges on government projects. So if we do at some point have to actually have taxes to continue to rebuild our infrastructure, the cost of the projects will be less than half they are now, because there'll be no interest charge attached. So right now, for example, if the government wanted, say, $200 billion to rebuild the Gulf Coast, it could borrow the $200 billion from the banks, and the Fed would create enough reserves so the banks would have it to loan to us, and they would loan us our own money, let's say, for 30 years at a 5% interest. At 5% interest on $200 billion, that's $10 billion a year in interest. So after 30 years, we would have rebuilt the Gulf to the tune of $200 billion. At the end of 30 years, we would have paid the $300 billion in interest, but we'd still owe the $200 billion we borrowed in the first place. That's how insane this present system is. Of course, it's not insane if you're the ones that's benefiting from it. Let me tell you a story that I think is relevant and a little bit of humor. An alien suddenly appeared in New Orleans and saw all the damage. He asked what had happened and was told about Hurricane Katrina. He said, "Did that just happen?" And he said, "No, it was 2 years ago." Then he said, "Well, why don't you rebuild? Don't you have the technology? Don't you have the material? Don't you have the workers?" And the answer said, "Oh yeah, we have all of that, but we don't have the money." The alien asked, "What's money?" And he was told, "Well, basically it's small pieces of green paper with numbers written on it." The alien took out his telecommunicator and said, "Beam me up, there's no intelligent life on this planet." The next step would be full employment of the nation's workforce. The American Monetary Act supports, quote, "full employment of the nation's working population," unquote. The federal government will become the employer of last resort. Anyone unable to find a private sector job could work for the federal government at a living wage of at least $8 per hour plus benefits in programs similar to the, I'm old enough to remember these, I voted for Franklin Roosevelt, the old WPA, Works Progress Administration, or the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Also, they could be working in programs to provide daycare for children of working families or other beneficial programs to help the people. There will be no unemployment except for voluntary unemployment. Welfare payments will be limited to those who, for physical or mental reasons, are unable to work. With a job available to everyone at a living wage, there will be more economic activity, which of course will create even more private sector jobs. Businesses will also save money because the unemployment tax, which is about 2.1% on wages, will be eliminated. If there's no unemployment, you don't need an unemployment tax. And if the real employment rate, they say right now it's about 4%, but I think the real employment rate is probably more like 10%. There would be, at 10% rate, there'd be about 15 million people working for the government at a total cost of $230 billion per year. We would just spend that $230 billion into circulation. I'll address what we would do if it gets to the point where we can't spend it without creating inflation. Next, we must adjust the money supply to allow for population growth. I already touched on that. We would need to spend at least $100 billion a year into circulation because of the growth of the population, consumer goods and services. And I think a good way to spend that $100 billion in the year and get into circulation and give a tax cut to every American worker and save Social Security at the same time. And we can do this by exempting the first $25,000 of earned income from the 6.2% employee share of the Social Security tax. If they make $25,000 or more, that would be a tax cut of up to $1,550 per year per worker. If they make less than $25,000, it would be 6.2% of that amount. And this tax cut would go entirely to Americans who make less than $90,000 per year, because those that make over $90,000 a year presently don't pay any Social Security tax on the amount above $90,000. It should, and the first $25,000 should be exempted, but it's because it's certainly needed to pay for the basic necessities. At the present time, the Social Security tax is basically the income tax upside down and backwards. Percentage-wise, the more money you make, the less money you pay. The program would be mostly paid for by removing the present $90,000 cap on Social Security taxes, which would mean that those earning over $90,000 per year would pay the same percentage tax rate as everyone else. After removing the cap, the annual cost of this program would only be about $100 billion, and we're going to need that much for the growth of population anyhow. And last but not least, pay about $3 billion a year or less to have, if we can get Congress to do it, publicly financed national elections. That was brought up a few minutes ago, and that certainly is part of the problem. We need to get big money out of the process and make our members of Congress and the President responsible to their constituents instead of those who now finance their campaigns. What a bargain that $3 billion a year would be. Now let's summarize what's just been said we're going to do or should do as this system starts. There would be two one-time only additions to the real money supply. The one-time dividend of $370 billion with the $2,000 check to everybody on the Social Security rolls, and paying off the $5.1 trillion publicly held portion of the national debt as it comes due. And I admit that paying this portion of the national debt off to those who hold it is going to mainly benefit the very wealthy who benefit from the present system, and this action for the moment sort of validates the money that they in effect have stolen from us with this system. This can and should be addressed with a wealth tax and a new, far more progressive tax structure. But due to time limitations, we'll have to discuss that later. And I'm pretty sure that on Saturday, Dave Kelly is going to cover this issue in some depth and has ways to make our tax system more fair and progressive. There are 4 continuing programs that I just mentioned. That's rebuilding the infrastructure, full employment, saving Social Security, publicly financed elections. Those add up to $533 billion per year. Also, the present $46 trillion worth of debt money would be reduced to approximately 37 trillion with the cancellation of the U.S. securities held by the Fed paying off the national debt. And this 37 trillion of debt will gradually disappear as the debts are paid. And under the 100% reserve requirement on demand deposits, when these debts are paid, banks will no longer be able to loan that amount of money back into circulation. They'll only be able to loan real money. And all of this could be accomplished tax-free and interest-free. This is a dividend from the Fed 100% reserve system, a system that truly works for the people, not against them. And after the first year, we will probably have spent about 3.5 trillion, my best estimate, into circulation. This compares to our present estimated debt money supply of 12.5 trillion. Too much of that 12.5 trillion, as I already noted, is in the hands of too darn few people. Obviously, it is quite probable we will have to spend even more money into circulation. Remember that we are replacing all debt money with real permanent money. So spending 3.5 trillion into circulation is quite likely going to be insufficient. The 3.5 trillion we spend into circulation during the first year is in addition to our supply of coins and currency. The Fed can tell us right now how many Federal Reserve notes are in circulation, but they can't tell us how many are in circulation just in the United States. When we replace Federal Reserve notes with U.S. notes, we will know, and then we can keep track of that. And many people, when hearing about the American Monetary Act, and this has been mentioned by several speakers, and the fact that we will be spending money directly into circulation, immediately worry that this is going to be inflationary, when the fact is that during the transition, it's far more likely that we will face deflationary pressures because we have not spent enough money into circulation. It seems that it's extremely difficult for people to understand that we are spending real permanent money into circulation in replacement of, not in addition to, our present supply of debt money. When we change to a 100% reserve requirement on demand deposits, banks can't create any more of that debt money, so we have to spend this money into circulation. Otherwise, when all the loans were paid off, we wouldn't have any money except coins and currency. And for all of you who chair AMI chapters, be sure and impress on those who attend your meetings that when we spend real permanent money into circulation, it's in replacement of what we use for money now, not in addition to. That's why it's not inflationary. I know from personal experience that people have great difficulty understanding what I just said. I guess we've all been so brainwashed about the present debt-based system for so long, we have difficulty believing that there is a much better and much more equitable system available. That system is outlined in the American Monetary Act, and I'm sure all of you have copies. If you don't, they're back there. One other important point, those who now control our money and thus control our world will not give up that power easily. Remember Henry Kissinger, whoever controls money controls the world. They will use all of their wealth and all of their power to stop our legislation from becoming law. That's why, at least in my opinion, I think the only time we have a real chance, we have to be ready and we have to get more people educated, but the only real chance we're going to have to get this act passed will be during the coming financial catastrophe. And the exponential debt growth that you saw on those red bars on that chart indicates that that financial catastrophe cannot be far away. As I've said before, the present system is a mathematical impossibility. We cannot forever grow exponentially in a finite world, but the present system needs to do exactly that to keep from collapsing. That seems to be another thing which is very difficult for people to understand, even when they're looking at that chart showing how our debt is now exploding. It just boggles my mind that they can't see what I seem to see. Assuming that we were able to pass our legislation and implement our plan, it may well be that the programs I just outlined will not spend enough real money into circulation. and that we may have to declare another dividend of maybe $2,000 per person. That's the fastest way to put more money into circulation throughout the country to do the most good. And it may need to be done several times, and I don't think doing it would be unpopular with the people. Not many of us would object to a $2,000 windfall. And how much real permanent dollars, that was what I said I was addressing when I started. How many real permanent US dollars do we need to have in our permanent money supply? Quite frankly, we don't know. That's why we will have to go slowly in spending new money into circulation. We're pretty sure we won't need that $12.5 trillion, but we really don't know the proper level. We'll find it as we go. It's certainly easier to spend more money, real money, into circulation than it is to have to go back and tax it back out. But if we do find ourselves at that point at some time that is in the position of too much money in circulation, the Monetary Board could have the power to declare a temporary sales tax of perhaps 5%, drain off the excess money, and just destroy it. It should be noted that when we have spent into circulation the total amount of real US dollars needed and can no longer sustain the programs that I outlined, that $533 billion a year, by simply spending money into circulation, we'll be able to sustain those programs just with the interest savings we will achieve by not having to borrow our own money into circulation. Or we could use Kenny's process of loaning it interest-free. That would work also. For example, our present debt money supply of about $12.5 trillion, if you even apply just a low 5% interest rate, that's over $600 billion a year. We're paying $600 billion a year rent to use our own money that we could issue ourselves. That's more than the whole cost of all the programs I've outlined. All of these things truly are possible when we use real permanent US dollars instead of the present debt dollars. The programs and tax cuts just described are what the present system has been stealing from us in the form of unnecessary interest charge and unnecessary taxes. Both the Congress and the President will be made aware of the Monetary Board's decisions, but because both Congress and the President and the people would know this if they were properly educated, under an honest monetary system, the Congress and the President and the Monetary Board would be held directly accountable for any inflation or deflation. There's still one other point to cover: deficit spending. If Congress continues its deficit spending, instead of borrowing the deficit in the form of interest-bearing government securities, as is done now, the Treasury would simply issue non-interest-bearing United States money to pay for that shortfall, the money that Congress spent that they didn't have. And some will say that creating new US dollars to cover deficit spending is inflationary. But you must understand the Fed already does exactly the same thing. But the Fed does it by creating new bank reserves so the banks can create new debt money out of nothing and loan it back to the government and charge them interest for the use of their own money, putting us deeper in debt. That's how we got the $9 trillion debt in the first place. When Congress spends more than it has under the existing system, the Fed adds both to our money supply and to our total debt. Under the 100% reserve system, it will add to the money supply only. I have covered most aspects of passing the American Monetary Act. Now let me briefly address the fiscal aspects, particularly tax policy. And this is going to be very brief. As I noted on my fact sheet, the current extreme maldistribution of wealth must be addressed. I have brought copies of a proposed tax schedule which I made up, which would make the distribution of wealth more fair and would tax all income the same. They may have passed it out, I don't know, or else it's back on the table. There is no time today to cover this, but it's a good subject for a future discussion. And by the way, at the top of that tax schedule, it says AMI tax schedule. That doesn't mean it's the official AMI tax schedule. It's just the way I keep track of my AMI files. I name them all in Word. I name them AMI first and then the name of the file, so they're all grouped together. That's why it says AMI tax schedule. I just wanted to make that clear. And copies, as I said, are available, and the chart and the graph and the facts that I had at the beginning. And And as I said, I think this graph with those red bars showing our debt going into the stratosphere is the most important graph I've ever made in my life, because it forecasts what's going on, and it forecasts the coming collapse, and that collapse will come when we cannot or will not go even deeper in debt. I guess maybe former Federal Reserve Chairman William McChesney Martin, who many years ago I had some several page long exchanges with, and he did answer me, which is more than happens now. I think he may have said it best years ago. You may have heard this. He said that it's easy to restrict the money supply. That's like pulling, he's talking about the present system, that's like pulling on a string. But it's not so easy to increase the money supply. That's like pushing on a string, which means that while the Fed can supply unlimited amounts of so-called reserves to the banks can't force people to borrow more debt money into existence. The banks can't just push on the string. They have to have somebody on the other end pulling. And when nobody is on the other end pulling, we will have reached the mathematical end of our debt-based system. Of course, under the American Monetary Act, it will be easy to put the needed real money into circulation. The Congress would just spend it into circulation, and I don't think Congress would have a problem doing that. I should probably mention that I really thought the present system would have collapsed by now. I was concerned about it 50 years ago when I first learned this problem, when I talked to somebody and said the national debt's almost $300 billion, we have to do something about it. And I fortunately was talking to somebody that understood the monetary system, and that's when I got first involved 50 years ago. But those running this system have been highly creative in finding new ways to create more debt. And it's debt the system needs to survive. But eventually, the current exponential explosion of debt has to make the present system collapse of its own weight. I don't know, and we just don't know when. Thank you very much, and now I think there's some time for questions or comments.